Welcome everyone to Voices with Vervaeke. I'm joined once again by my two good friends, Jordan Hall and Gregg Enriquez. And Jordan has proposed that we talk about the Universal College and its connections and associations with analogous things like the community of the saints or the scientific community, etc. So, and how this is relevant to the meta-narrative, the meta-dialogue that's happening, the meta-conversation right now. So I'm going to turn things over to Jordan, and I'll let him frame it and put it into a form that will invoke discussion.
Okay, I'm going to throw a bunch of curveballs right now, just to keep things quite open. All right, so I'll start with an insight that came to me when I was reading Graeber's book, 5,000 Years of Debt. And I thought it was powerful. It's very deep insight. And by the way, it coordinated with some of the stuff, John, that you talked about in your meaning series, which was, and oddly enough, Gregg didn't really say, like, extended as far as I can tell, not at all. So he pointed out that there was a series of major cycles in the nature of money. Right? So you had a period where money originated in a particular milieu. It went through a series of almost like programmatic developmental stages, and then it reached a kind of a frothy point of as abstract as it could possibly be, as debased as it could possibly be, and then it collapsed. Right? Usually in association with the civilization that was indexed by that particular monetary system. So, you know, he looked at Bronze Age currencies and noticed that happened in the Bronze Age collapse. Was coordinated with the collapse of a Bronze Age monetary system. The collapse of the Classical Age, obviously the Roman system had gone through a very similar cycle and had completely collapsed. And there's a bunch of other points that were kind of coordinating at what you might call the mode of the secular. Right? These things had all kind of entrained. But there was a point at which the structure of the monetary system had reached kind of almost like a frothy, foamy insanity. And then the mode that followed that was a mode that coordinates very tightly with the conversation we just had on the Stoa, which was to say a recovery of the commons, a settling into a very liminal state, a place of lots of novelty and emergence in a very shamanic mode, like a lot of transcendence from old structures and the emergence of new psychotechnologies. Of course, in this case, we're talking about the axial age, and then the age of the classical religions, the emergence of Christianity and Islam. And so it's almost like a movement, a cycle between the secular and the sacred, or the profane and the sacred, if you prefer.
Right.
And that I read this in 2008, so it was like a very interesting. And then as time has progressed, I've noticed that model raises some interesting notions in where we are. Right? Perhaps the best way of understanding where we are is a place where the movement is a movement away from sociology, from institutions that are happening out there in the world of the material, in the world of redistribution or the production and distribution of material goods, and a turn in the direction of the commons, a turn in the direction of the sacred. And I'm using those two terms in the way we were discussing them earlier in a previous point in hyper conversation. And just FYI, noticing that because of the way the hyper conversation operates, and even the notion of hyper conversation itself being a term that isn't introduced into common currency before then, that video has not been made public, as far as I know. It may not be made public until after this video comes out. So you'll have a really interesting temporal flip where things that we said in sort of one version of reality, one version of timelines happened a week ago, but because it's not made public on YouTube until later, there's an inversion. So just use that, by the way, as an embodied experience of some of the underlying characteristics of the nature of transcendent transmedia conversation or hyper conversation. So that's one way of framing it. Right? That's part of the term. Another way of framing it is almost from the point of view of the crisis of education. This is Zach Stein's angle.
Zach's work.
He's the one who gave me the language, The Invisible College, which is a real story from the 30 Years' War. But the proposition is something like, one of the if we think about the meta crisis that we're kind of going into, which has lots of different characteristics, of which the meaning crisis is kind of a way of looking at the meta crisis from a lens. One of the things we have is we've got a a continuity of expertise problem. So we
Yep.
have this machine, this civilization machine, and it's complicated as hell. And there's a lot of embodied knowledge necessary to keep it running effectively. And we have a really rather astoundingly dysfunctional, I call it education system, or cultural process of enculturating and developing young people. Right? So we have the situation where you've got, and I don't want to, this is not an aspersion, these people are the victims of this problem, but you've got millennials in like their 30s who are developmentally still not out of adolescence and don't have any meaningful access to the machinery of civilization simultaneously because those slots are still occupied and they don't have access to the institutional knowledge to run it. Right. So what happens is that as people begin to die off of just old age, giant chunks of institutional knowledge will just disappear and there are no people to fill those slots. And we've not produced people to actually run the machinery of civilization. It's a very poorly designed civilization that literally cannot reproduce itself. Okay, well, that's an interesting problem. By the way, I'll just make it very concrete, just to kind of make it super concrete. This is not well known, but there's in the United States, the guys who take taxes called the Internal Revenue Service, or the IRS. And the IRS, as effectively all institutions these days, runs a lot of what they do on software. They built a huge software system. Their software system runs on a language called COBOL.
Oh.
And there's effectively nobody who knows how to use COBOL anymore. Like, it's not taught anywhere. You can't even import people from outside of the country to run COBOL. Nobody knows how to do it. And of course, it's a small cohort of people who are now consultants, who are in their 60s and 70s, who understand the code base and understand COBOL. And when those guys die, there's going to be like this giant gap in what the hell to do with this code that people literally don't even know how to understand the language. It's like it's written in Hittite. And we're running our Internal Revenue Service on Hittite, and the last Hittite scholars are about to pass away, and everybody's like, oh, well. So that's an example, right? It's a very kind of concrete example, but just scale that across the entire civilization machinery. So, you've kind of got, if you run the logic on that, there's essentially two major paths that come from that implication. One is, the civilization begins to collapse under its own incapacity to run its own machinery. And until it reaches some carrying capacity where it can sort of be reproductive. And that might be quite a significant collapse. If you look for at what point are there actually people who have the capacity to coordinate and run the machinery of civilization, it might be a lot of collapse before it hits a steady state. The other path is a path where we basically bootstrap ourselves into some new form of civilization machinery that can actually, let's call it, like, I hate to use the metaphor because it feels dehumanizing, but it's kind of easy to understand, that can run on people that we have now. Right? So the people who we have produced, and trying to run something, we have an old system, we don't have people on, right? They can't, those two things are incompatible. Is there a way for us to actually design some kind of system that can meet human needs at the levels that people are, right? Where we actually have, meet the needs of all the people in the world. To be perfectly frank, using the people that we have, right? Can we do that? Like, we have to actually go back the other direction. And the answer to that, the proposal that I put out there with Zach, and then has become part of the conversation that I bring in here, the frame, and I'm almost done, was the Invisible College, which is to say, and the word of, you call it what, the Society of the Saints? What was that called?
The Communion of the Saints.
Communion of the Saints, the Society of Friends, the Fellowship, right? And by the way, interestingly enough, I think a deeper understanding of the notion of the scientific community,
right?
Which is something like a peer-to-peer, collaborative, co-creative, sort of developmental / educational, again, collective intelligence, right? So what we are doing right now, where we basically learn how to orient ourselves towards those relationships that are simultaneously the ones where we are able to be of most service to the other, and where the other is able to be of most service to us, and the we together are able to produce something which has the most service to the whole. And by building that skillfulness, we begin to start constellating a sort of a network of relationships that upgradient the individual and collective capacity at a bespoke level. Like we're literally creating a bespoke educational system in a like at a cube. So the curve is like the volume of the sphere, very steep. That then becomes an expanding sphere capacity, and the once you get that invisible college moving, the emergent property, or the what we call the surplus value that's thrown off by this explosion in capacity, individual and collective, then becomes the thing that begins to design the rest of the civilization machinery. And I point back to the invisible college because that was actually the idea that was come up with during the 30 Years' War. We need to do something like that. And that invented the infrastructure that became the world that we're living in, more or less. So it's not like a crazy idea. It's just it's not an utterly mad idea. It's just a crazy idea.
Right.
All right.
Right.
And so is the proposal that the universal college is something that we see already taking shape in some maybe a nascent form, or is it that we're talking about something more de novo that needs to be brought into existence?
And it's invisible, right? Or at least invisible. The name of it was invisible. But it's interesting then that you said a universal, right, John?
Oh,
actually.
Might be an interesting.
I take that as an interesting, like,
yeah. Well, I'm trained as a Freudian too, so I catch
the phallic college. I don't understand what's going on.
Yeah, it's like
I think that was because
I slipped that in there.
Yeah, no, I think well, there might be Freudian reasons, Greg. I'm not denying that, but I think the conceptual reasons might be. I was thinking of the community of the saints, and then the Catholic Church, the universal, right? Because the Catholic Church was always explicitly included the communion of the saints, not just the living people. Because I was trying to also allude to Zach's point about we've got to make this an intergenerational thing, or it's not a viable thing. Right. And that's what, that's the part of the scientific community. It knows how to reproduce itself in a regular and reliable manner.
Cool. So I want to hear more about that, by the way. Something tells me that's super important. So what I would say in response to that question is something along the lines of, I would like to awaken this thing that is happening in its unconscious into a consciousness of its own happening. Thereby to allow it to support its own becoming with increasing intelligence and precision. This then connects extremely closely to wisdom energy.
Totally. This is the this is echoing of my entire life's mission, really. This starts to get me very alive. And what I mean by that is, because the problem, I'll throw out the problem, okay? Because what's happened to our knowledge system, all right, we have this unbelievable intergenerational problem of how do we socialize the next generation into a phase space that nobody knows what the hell is going to be, okay? And the paradigms are happening so fast that the old systems are back in cobalt, right? And all of a sudden we're in a digital virtual. Okay. And I would argue that although what John said is right in an ideal sense about what science, it's also the case that science, devoid of a synthetic philosophical framing, has given rise to a rhizome of chaos, to use a Deleuzian term, okay, which basically means that we're stuck with an enormous amount of specificity and chaotic knowledge. So you go to the university and then you get into the paradigm of the professor and the research program that can burrow into a particular perspective, okay? But what I see happening is that the macro perspective of relation of this unbelievably specific knowledge pertaining to this unbelievably specific knowledge pertaining to the collapse of philosophy basically gives rise to we have a fragmented pluralism of chaos, okay? So let's put these things together. You have an accelerating system into a very, very high, confusing, adjacent possible of uncertainty, a digital virtual world. You have a knowledge system that's increasing in terms of its information flood, but decreasing in terms of its comprehensibility, at least for effective sense making. And now we have to tunnel all that in and upload a new operating system for being. That becomes, it's a very, very you could see if this doesn't become aware and then actually have some sense-making capacity to consciously cultivate, I don't think it's going to happen. That's why I think this is so important. It's like, holy shit, we have a serious intersecting set of deeply complicated issues, and we need tools and philosophies and methods and processes to spread, to cultivate the transition so the education of the next generation is not generation omega, but the back half of the 21st century, right? That actually is sustainable.
Okay. So that was a great formulation of the problem, Gregg. Excellent. I'm going to try and make it worse, not your formulation, but the problem, because the thing we've done before, like after the 30 Years' War, when, I mean, let's remember, part of what drove this scientific revolution was the 30 Years' War. I am still stunned when I read Leibniz and his confidence that the people would be able to sit down and calculate, and there would be no reason to fight anymore. Like this utopic vision that scientific rationality, the mathematization of cognition, would render us free forever from human conflict. But the point I'm making is, there was nevertheless, right, a cultural space in which he could do that. This was the space of philosophy, or the space of philosophy and religion, right? And the problem, I think that's exactly the space we are talking about. I don't mean philosophy in the academic sense. I mean what we in Pierre Hadot's sense. And I think that's what Gregg is pointing to. He's not talking about academic philosophy, and I'm not dissing academic philosophy. Gregg's talking about the kind of thing that Leibniz and Spinoza represented in the scientific revolution, and Descartes. They're trying to use this to alleviate the anxiety, to bring peace, all of that, all of the Enlightenment, the historical period vision. Here's the thing: we now have a sustained critique, beginning with the pragmatists and the phenomenologists, and then coming into the post-structuralists, and then various. This term postmodernism is largely a useless term, because it puts together deconstructionists that come out of post-structuralism, and Foucault, which is a different thing. Like, and there's all this different stuff that's gets, and then Rorty doesn't come out of that tradition at all. He comes out of, James and Pierce.
More American
pragmatism. Yeah, but nevertheless, so I'm being explicit here that I'm not lumping them together as some homogeneous group. Nevertheless, in various ways, there is a convergence of a critique of that space, the space that has been used before in order to try and get the meta-dialogue, the meta-discourse, dare I say it, the meta-narrative that will allow us to do the coordination across these divides in order to respond to Gregg's point. So what I'm doing is I'm saying everything Gregg said, yes, and then notice what Gregg intuitively reached towards. But I know he knows this, so I'm not saying something new to him, but that space that we have historically reached towards in order to try and do this before has been undermined by various, not homogeneous, various, which makes it especially difficult, because if it was a single homogeneous critique, we might be able to just respond to it, right? But the fact that it's these various things, convergent, makes that, really calls that space, I'm calling it, that sort of analogous to the hyperspace, right? That hypercultural space, unavailable to us, because we're told, right, that to go there is illegitimate through and through, epistemically illegitimate, politically illegitimate, and ethically illegitimate. So
and it's wrong. They're wrong. Okay, that's what I believe. I believe they're fundamentally wrong, and the reason that they're fundamentally wrong, at least partially wrong, okay, is because they may sound somewhat egotistical, but they lack the justification systems theory in the tree of knowledge. They did not. There was a fundamental perspective that I believe synthetic philosophy is missing, especially as it takes its deconstructive post-structuralist turn and turns into philosophy of language and language games coming off of Wittgenstein. And if they can't put language games on top of natural science in a particular way, but actually if you have justification systems theory and the tree of knowledge, you actually can align that perspective in a radically different and much more conciliant fashion, especially if you solve the problem of psychology. So I will say absolutely that this meta-narrative critique from all the angles that you layered out, okay, is exaggerated in its claims of the impossibility of such. And especially if we go back and fix some of the Enlightenment errors around matter and mind and what science is relative to social knowledge. And that I say all that with excitement because actually, if there is coherence and meta-coherence for psychotechnologies, then the invisible college becomes a lot more feasible. That's the point, that you can channel through sense making and distribute it with a lot more resonance and attunement if that's feasible.
All right, this is gonna be fun because I was pretty confident that what John was describing from the point of view of the postmodern critique and what Gregg had previously said about things like the incommensurability of distinct paradigms and the incapacity of what I would call the paradigmatic mode to respond to the velocity of novelty in the sphere of what can be known were effectively coordinate. And so what I think I want to do is I actually want to see if I can stitch that together so it works, i.e. can I create a higher dimensional space here, like a triangle out of what was previously a line that actually causes these things to align. So let me tell you the way I was thinking about it.
Excellent.
It actually very much feels to me like it's like the dimensional or the geometric metaphor is a strong way of looking at it. So if I have a series of, let's just call them dots, like nodes, well, people with minds.
Yep.
There's one approach, and John, you and I have talked about this also in the distance or the distinction between narrative and dialogos.
Yes, very much.
Right? So I'm
Narrative
invoking that same distinction. Okay.
Dialogos.
So the visual image I have is a circle, which is happening as like a plane, and each like I'll make a photograph. Each person's head is like intersected by the circle. So you got a whole bunch of people and they're kind of like floating around. They have like this circle that's sort of bisecting all their heads. The circle is a shared narrative, right? It's a shared system of justification, right? It's a shared semantic in a Derridian sense, or a language game that has some internal mechanism for disambiguating epistemological and moral claims, right? That allows a coordination between and among the individuals who are in that circle.
Yes.
Okay. That is the way that's the Enlightenment model, right? The Enlightenment figured that machine out, tuned it up, cranked on it, and here we are.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. The proposition is you've got a situation whereby the distinct efforts to expand that circle to continue to metabolize the expanding surface area, or in this case, the perimeter of novelty, right? As we encounter novelty, you actually start having breakdowns in the communication capacity to continue to maintain the integrity of the circle. This is what Gregg was pointing out, right? I got people who are like drilling down epistemologically into something like, high energy physics. People over here are drilling down into anthropology, and it begins to, Deleuzian rhizomatic chaos, right? Each tendril starts getting so far and so deep that the ability to maintain continuity between them starts to break down. You actually basically start having speciation events. Right? You start having micro niches of subgroups that are no longer commensurable. And they, in fact, begin increasingly incapable of communication, because even engaging in a bespoke intercommunication, a metastructure, which is what the Santa Fe Institute tries to do. Like, okay, let's take the economist and the sociologist and maybe some Jungian scholars, put them in a room, have them spend, a month trying to create a new bespoke communications platform where they bridge the gap and create a new circle. And now we're all in this sort of new circle. Can we run it, right? Even that series of processes, they all call them meta process, right? The meta process is a verticalization, meta narrative, right? An endeavor to find increasingly effective communications protocols and compression artifacts to be able to maintain the integrity of the continuity of the circles so that it can actually hold as a single object and coordinate the circles, right? It just breaks down. Like you literally run into bandwidth constraints at the level of human minds, right? People go insane. They can't hold that. And it takes so much fucking time to just communicate, to try to disambiguate our increasingly divergent language games, that even if we were operating in good faith and had high quality EQ and were good people and not fucking hominids hell-bent on killing each other, we couldn't pull it off, right? That's a different way of describing what the postmodern condition would look like. From one direction. The other direction is what, so one direction is at the level of like exploring the perimeter. The other direction is the fact that the process itself the mechanism whereby you endeavor to expand the circle has rate limits on the bandwidth that it can actually perceive reality, process reality, integrate that, and make sense of it as a sensible theory of knowledge, as a sensible system of justification. And as the horizon, the event horizon of the novelty space of reality continues to accelerate, you actually outstrip the bandwidth capacity of this entire coordination mechanism. So you've got an interior problem that begins to pull apart and substantiate, and its own carrying costs. By the way, just FYI, I'd apply the Tainter model at the socio-anthropological level, epistemological, and there's a fucking mapping, right? We literally just did a Tainter transform on the institution of knowledge construction, the institution of coordinated sense making. So that's what I was hearing when I was hearing both of you. And I think those two things coordinate. And so the answer is to say, okay, there needs to be and what I'm going to do is I'm going to invoke a concept here. And I don't know if it's the right one, but it's a move that I've made in the past that's worked. Which is what I want to move from a meta move to a transcendent move. Right? So I don't want to create a meta narrative. I want to create a transcendent narrative. I want to create something that transcends narrative as the locus, as the location in which the coordination structure is actually located. Right? So I don't want to look at the coordinated structure in the meta. I want to look at the coordination structure in the transcendent. And this is the transcendent, the transmedia narrative that we talked about. Isn't that fun? It just kind of comes back, right? The hyper conversation. Now, there's theoretical reasons for that because the bandwidth constraints in the transcendent are unlimited. You don't actually have a bandwidth constraint. So you don't have to worry about problems like, the problems we just described. But it requires a different architecture. Right? So this is the architecture I was describing. What happens is instead of having a single paradigm that connects all nodes, you actually have the capacity of nodes to create bespoke coordination environments at the level of the embodied, right? They have the capacity to generate a communications channel. The capacity at each node to create a communications channel is the thing that you're focusing on, right? So it's actually a very different network topology, right? It's funny how like the languaging here shifts so many different domains and invokes things that sometimes even sound banal. Like I'm literally describing just straightforward like network topology. But the point is, if you invest in generating particular nodes, people who have the capacity to engage in this kind of interrelationship in their exterior and in their communications methodologies, you now have a collective intelligence, a distributed cognition that can engage in the formation of bespoke paradigms, narrowly tailored. This is actually the self-selfing itself. Narrowly self in self at the level of the embodied, right? At the level of the material, at the physical, out of the virtual, out of the transcendent. Adequate to the location they find themselves in, respond to reality effectively, and also, by the way, not get committed to or addicted to the paradigmatic structure. So you actually also put a pin in the Kuhnian problem. You no longer have these sort of conservative architectures of self-preservation of institutions, because the institutions are very bespoke. You actually create the toolkit as you need it, invoke it. The domain is modeled and mapped. You go through the Persian S-curve, possibly even in a single conversation, depending on what's up. Do what needs to be done, and then you move on to the next aspect of life. And that is, so that's the, wow, sorry, I just tailed off. It feels like a rope that's frayed at the end.
Let me pick up on that because I think it's exactly
as it should be.
Okay, so here's one of the things that I'm tracking. So as I'm tracking myself in this whole evolution, so I discovered this thing, justification, okay? And I can then place the evolution of this culture person system on these evolution of systems of justification. And then we get the Kantian paradigm and the Newton paradigm in modernity, okay? Where you have a transcendental idealism, where we're gonna get reason, the ultimate reason, we're gonna search for the ultimate reason, and we're gonna use ultimate empiricism. And then together, this intersection of empiricism and transcendental idealism really becomes the reason for progress that legitimizes this sort of ultimate logos paradigm that is true for modernity, okay? And then you operate underneath of that. Now, all of the stuff we were talking about is like, well, that's bullshit. Like, you can't have that, okay? And now we're left with, well, like my dad, he's a modernity. I was just talking to him. It's like, well, Dad, what's going to happen in the back end is, unlike you who committed to a particular paradigm, this I just told him, that it is that he used to be evangelical, then he became academic, and now he's sort of quasi-Newtonian science, and this is what right-minded thinking people understand to be true, right? And then I don't believe, oh, you're interested in indigenous stuff? Oh, I'm skeptical of that. It's like, it's like he's living in a particular modernist paradigm that is then interpreted to be true. And he's, paid and established and all of this for that, right? But if you jump out of it for him, then all of a sudden what he's committed to wobbles, and he gets he wants to back down. And I told him, I was like, listen, I'll jump into any number of different, it's fluid, okay? And then I'll just hit whatever paradigmatic justification system that is operating in the culture. And what I think what's gonna happen is that the fluid capacity to drop in, to be a part of, have that form, and then have it dissolve, as long as we anchor it into not necessarily a meta narrative, but a meta sacred value of wisdom commoning, so that we actually have what are the necessary pictures and constraints that allow these paradigms to be felt, to move together, like, dignity, well-being, and integrity, or love and agape, or whatever would be the basic kind of ways of being need to transcend. Okay? And then that gets into wisdom energy of the essence of being. But these systems of justification, which we will use, and this would be very Peircean and pragmatic, it's like, well, what works in the context? You can definitely get there. And I would say, actually, there are opportunities for abstraction that actually bring me back somewhat to Kant, but ultimately not in the path that he was arguing for. But that's a different angle on the conversation, but I totally am in sync with that, I think.
So what I'm getting from both of what you said is, we're talking about, well, we've talked about this before. We're talking about not just the evolution of form, we're talking about the evolution of evolvability. We're talking from moving from a fixation on our products and our results, which we can't make universal or claim to be universal anymore, to processes that are nevertheless universal. And that comes together.
Actually, pause. That's right, John. That's it, right? It's a process move. It's a total process move. The processes of justification are universal, actually. But the contents of what it is that they jam in the operating system, that's a totally different angle. I love that shift. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Greg. I was just about to say, I can see why you and I have come together, because that move you just said lines up with the move I've been trying, I've been trying to get at the universal process of the ongoing evolution of our cognitive evolvability, which I have termed relevance realization as central. And I'm just, so in response to what both of you said in that orientation, I'm suggesting, well, why don't we take a look at the wisdom energy within sort of cognition, individual cognition, to see if it gives us models for distributed cognition. And two things that I've done work on, and I want your help. Like, what would that? One is the brain seems to, I would argue, not everybody agrees with what I'm going to say, but I would argue, and I've made these arguments extensively and published on them, so I won't do all that back argument to save time. But the idea is, what the brain does is it interlocks two things together. It forms recursive small world networks, which aren't hierarchically organized, that don't organize towards the convergent meta narrative of the monarchical vision, as Paul van der Klee calls it. That's not, we wanted to find the boss in the brain, and we looked and we looked and we looked and we looked, and then we realized, oh shit, there is no boss in the brain. The brain is not organized according to an Iron Age society. That's not how it's organized. That's one side, and they're interlinked. The other is the brain seems to operate, again, multi-scale, self-organizing criticality. It oscillates between coherence, right, in order to get something, to frame it, and then it breaks it apart in order to open up the space of possibilities so that a new reframing is possible. And the thing is, if you fire as a self-organizing criticality, you will tend to wire as a small world network. And if you wire as a small world network, it will tend to make you fire as self-organizing criticality. Now, there's one more thing in here, and this may go in with the Jubilee, I'm not sure, because what the brain does is it's set up to disrupt its own processing periodically. The brain, we mind wander. There's a reason why we mind wander. It is metabolically expensive and it does shit for us in the world. You know why we mind wander? Because what we're doing is we're disrupting, right? We're throwing in noise, right? We throw in noise. If you're locked in a problem, one of the best strategies, there's experimental evidence for this, is to moderately distract yourself. And this has been a problem for me. I mean, a theoretical problem, because I presented this at SPP, the Society for Philosophy and Psychology. It's like, if at the core of wisdom is insight, and insight requires all these non-inferential disruptive strategies, does that mean that wisdom is not actually a rational virtue? And I was trying to argue that nevertheless it is. So what I'm trying to say is, because what I see emerging, nascent, is, right, we know that the internet is trying to set itself up like a recursive small world network, although there's powers that are trying to manipulate that and turn it into a hierarchical Iron Age structure. So there's two things happening there. It's not clear if there's anything like self-organizing criticality there, but I don't know. It just seems to me that what we're talking about is we want to try and set up these dynamic small world networks that are processing communication in a self-organizing criticality manner, that they cohere, and then it's like opponent processing, and then they know that they should decohere. Maybe I'm misusing your term, Jordan. I apologize if I am. But they break up, right? And then and they periodically introduce disruption into their own processing. You have to do this with neural networks. You have to throw noise into the networks, or they will overfit to the data. They will get locked into a hyper paradigmatic framing, and they will lose their capacity to generalize. You don't want to throw in too much noise, because then they'll underfit, and they'll be like a conspiracy theory machine gone crazy, right? And you got to get that.
It's the fine line. I mean, well, there's a lot of fine line dialectics, right? But one is the order chaos dialectic that you're navigating, and in relationship to this, when I was first forming the tree of knowledge, and then into theory of knowledge society, I was like, what we're after is this integrated pluralism. Okay, and integrated pluralism emphasizes the dialectic between some sort of unity, coherent integration. There is an integrated information system. And when we do consciousness, particularly perspectival consciousness, is about focal, right? It's about pulling and focusing on the figure relative to the ground, while the non-conscious processing is a little bit more parallel. But the point I would make is that we are looking at a dialectic between pluralism and diversity and exploration. But if that spins off, then you get unmanageable chaos. And then you have to kind of come back in relationship to, but there's also an integration, because the system has to have coordination. There has to be some parts in relation, right? To be in coordinated and integrated system. So it's that there's a dialectical principle and process between those.
Right. And so I think what we're offering here is we're saying there is no meta narrative. There's the possibility of the meta dialogue, and there's a meta vision, in the sense that, look, if we all play this, if we all agree to play this together,
right,
this will work for all of us so much better than if any one of us tries to lock it down in a paradigmatic fashion. And so I think that's the idea. I'm trying to coin a new epistemic access to this space. This idea of like a meta vision, where what we're doing.
I like that.
Look, if we all understand this process, right, that doesn't mean we have to agree at the level even of our beliefs. But what we see is we all need each other, because we all need each other to make these dynamic small world networks that are constantly doing self-organizing criticality. And we will agree to faithfully, in fellowship, be disruptive strategies to each other. And then the difficulty I think we face, one difficulty, not the difficulty, that was way too pretentious. One of the difficulties we face is we've got a language, I got to be really careful here. We have the language of inclusion and diversity is rampant right now, right? But the problem with that is it's oriented on the product, right? So what I mean by that, I've talked about the manifest and the latent before around this. There is a lot of discussion, right, an emphasis of diversity, but that's the level of the lives and the beliefs that are produced. What is wanted latently is absolutely monological process. We will all think the same way. We will all, right? We will all agree on this. And so that's a problem, I think, right, that we're facing. I think this, I don't want to be hypercritical here, and I don't want to be unfair, but I think the mania for inclusion right now, it has legitimate justice concerns behind it. But part of it is that it is a last ditch attempt to try and let's get everybody back together and hold us all in the same circle, to use Jordan's metaphor. And as long as we're trying to hold us all in the same circle, right, I think it's problematic. I think we need a genuine metaphysical diversity and epistemological diversity, but I think it has to be, like Gregg was emphasizing, I think it has to be bound to a shared metavision and a shared universalism of a process. And those two mutually support each other. Like, this is the way, what we all have to agree we need, that sounds monarchical, is we all have to agree that we need to be a much more evolvable system as a whole, individually and collectively. This is how we have to do it. And this is what we need to pursue. Sorry, that was a lot, but I was just trying to, like, bring it together. And like I said, I have an ambivalent attitude to the whole social justice movement, because I think there are genuine issues. I think people of color have been disenfranchised and are harmed in so many ways, and we have militarized the police in a way that is really harmful. I don't want to deny any of that. I think it's important and we need to address it. What concerns me is that we are culturally licensing a way of thinking that is trying to do the last ditch attempt of keeping the Enlightenment project of the shared circle, rather than, no, let's get a dynamical small world network that's firing in this continually self-organizing criticality fashion.
I'll drop a seed here, and then we can, Jordan, I know, but I'll drop Gregg Thomas and I have been having weekly conversations about this. He's a leader. He's got a way. He just did a wonderful course on cultural intelligence and how to appreciate the race and justice issues, and also be oriented towards transcending them. In a way that aligns very much, and I think John would be very in line with what you are there. So maybe we'll have a conversation at some point.
I would like to, and it's
a very powerful, and I will say, just for myself, as an academic who leans left and then get bowled over and had some personal issues that got hit hard on this issue, I have very ambivalent feelings about it. So it's a big conversation.
I do want to talk to Gregg. He reached out to me. Maybe we could set something up with him. I think that would be wonderful.
Well, actually, there's even maybe an invitation for us, me and Gregg, and then maybe all four of us possibly have a little bit at the STOA in February. So
that'd be nice.
So anyway.
So a few things that came up for me. One was I wanted to put out the notion of what would be called fractal self-symmetry at different levels of scale.
Yeah,
right.
So
scale and variance.
Yeah, scale and variance. And so the thing that is happening at the level right now of social mammals, if we can figure out how to attune it with the same mode or approach that happens at the level of, say, of a body, right? A single body. And that then begins to connect back up, right? And so this is actually, in some sense, also a return to the complex, a return to the ecology and the ecosystem. So a remembering of the continuity of contact of the whole, right? So that's a bringing into harmony. The other one, it's funny, these feel like they're like straws. They don't feel like they're part of a bundle. Had to do with a sense of Gregg like pointed up when he said anchoring. Like, well, but anchoring goes that way. You anchored down, like you're grounded. I was like, yeah, it's more like a groundedness in ordinary livingness. It's like the phrase that came up was something like, ethos before episteme. The phrase, it's funny. I was always so confused by the notion that like morality or religion is oftentimes presented as being antithetical to science. Right? Religion and science are sort of next to each other and enemies. When, from my point of view, it's sort of obvious that it works like this. And what I mean is this: things like values, ethical values, and by the way, I have a whole sort of notion of how the relationship between morality and ethics. But in this category, I can collapse them. Things like tell the truth, engage in only good faith critique. Those are sine qua non to the thing that we call science, right? We don't have people who commit with integrity and capacity to do things like tell the truth to other people, possibly from different cultures, right? And to only engage in good faith critique, right? Not try to snipe at people politically. Then science as a thing literally doesn't work at all. Right? So the method of
epistemic values.
Right, exactly. So that notion of religion is the thing, right? And religion that's not a religion, right? I'm pointing to that, is the thing that gives rise to a ground from which episteme can emerge.
Yes.
Absolutely.
The point we're making is if we design or we find a way to inventio a religion that is not a religion that has the right kind of characteristics and is strong enough, that is the ground, right? That's the thing that transcends or is more fundamental than all the different subsidiary episteme that will emerge and evaporate. And by the way, the socius, right? The various kind of sociological concretions that will gather around particular structures like this, that will also emerge and evaporate. In the context of a much more fundamental and distinctly non-paradigmatic, unrelated to paradigmatic constructs happening at this lower level.
Totally. Actually, and I'll just make a comment then, John. So when John and I were doing our journey together and untangling the world knot, and I was really internalizing his scale invariant multi-layered modeling, recursive relevance realization, as the fundamental process really to understand cognition across the domains. Basically, that's the way I was just sort of like, oh, this is actually how, not only how we do it, but also in a relevance realization way, how we ought to do it. I love John's beautiful placement of inventio, and how he does that realization and all that. And then, so then I was explaining to him that one of the pieces of the unified theory, I've mentioned this to you, is this thing called the influence matrix, which is this social mammal matrix that we basically have a self-other placement. And we're seeing ourselves vertically, we see ourselves horizontally, and then we see ourselves across the distance, and then we place ourselves in this. We do this before language. In fact, this is basically this is shining our propositional justifying knowledge. This is all perspectival participatory. And it's participant in the social matrix. And ego and alter are born together, to use James Mark Baldwin's. Okay, so now what is it? Now what hit me is I've always then emphasized as I built this thing is like, well, social influence. No, it's actually relational value. It's being known and valued, and having social influence in a complicated way. There's an instrumentality and a fundamental personal value. All the ethical philosophers say, well, is it a means or an end? And it's like, well, there's the end, personal connection, and there's the means, instrumentality, and there's all this dynamic. Okay. So, but what happened to me when I was listening to John is like, oh my gosh, actually what I built with the influence matrix, was a map of the intuitive, perspectival, participatory framing of motivation and emotion in relation.
Yeah, that was a brilliant move.
An implicit. And then when I was like, I'm now going to add John's cognitive perceptual map of recursive relevance realization. Then I, like for a whole week, I was like, oh my God, the participatory dance in relation is tracking. What we're constantly doing is tracking recursive relevance realization of self and relevant. And when we're doing it where it's like, oh my God, that's brilliant, John. Thanks so much. And we're in participatory, then you can feel, right? You feel the polyvagal system let go and you just feel open and loved, as opposed to, oh, that's bullshit. You don't know what the hell you're talking about. That's stupid. Why would you do that? You feel the polyvagal system go into low relational value defense, right? And the entire matrix of being, participatory matrix of being of justification is really this. This is the ground of all that paradigmatic BS. And we can actually hone it and create a wisdom energy commons around it, I think.
Yeah.
Was that tracked? Because that was sweet.
Yeah, that's right in the series. Yeah. Yeah. I forget. Is that episode
I think it's 11.
12? Yeah. Is it Greg? I
I
think.
think it's 11. 12 is the justification one.
Yeah,
It goes on top of that. But.
So I'm gonna say back some portion of it. I mean, you just said a lot of stuff. I want to say back some portion of it. Okay, gosh, there's so much. Let's see if I can try to put it in an order where it has the right kind of poetry to it. So it's something like, hey, there's a way we can do this thing, be in relationship with each other, right? Which includes things like talking and sharing perspectives and information and knowledge and understanding and skills and stuff like that, among other things. That particular way is like super good. It's like a good way of doing things. By the way, whenever we've actually noticed really good things happening in the past, it's always been as a result of getting better at doing this thing. So every time anything good has happened in the past, it's been because we've gotten better at doing this thing. So I would like to propose we actually take getting better at doing this thing as sort of a primary object. Right?
Yep.
Just that.
Yep.
And one of the consequences is things like, if you've ever been in a gathering, particularly of scientists, by the way, and I've noticed this particularly of scientists, it's like, and maybe it's Greg because of this sort of deepening, but egoic fragility and lack of capacity to participate in this way is sort of somewhat common. You get a bunch of scientists together and it devolves into a very adolescent kind of political egoic conflict, usually pretty rapidly. Not always, and you can kind of get maturity in there. But the point I'm trying to make there is to say, hey, imagine what would happen if that didn't get in the way. Imagine how much more sciencey we could be if we weren't trying to do science with a bunch of adolescents. If we actually had mature individuals deeply capable of engaging in, what would you call it, the vagal system, the
polyvagal, opening or closing,
of opening the polyvagal system and really truly being able to have like a not bullshitting themselves, so speaking truth with integrity and clarity and precision, and also listening extremely deeply to be able to actually engage in a good faith feedback that had insight and like pathos and ethos built into it. Like the synergy value of that approach to doing things would be a lot better than where we are now. Where we are now is a lot better than where we were 500 years ago, and we're talking about something which is a whole lot better than that, right? So the goodness of that is a lot. Like, it's be a good idea. Proposition is be a good idea. We should do more of that. Like, we should do that really. And then you can flip it. Say, oh, and by the way, if you remember the beginning of this conversation, if we don't do that, then things really get quite unpleasant, like in a bad way. So we should do the cool, fun, good stuff that you'll like, be good in an intrinsic. It'll make your hair more rich. Your skin will be ruddy. You'll have better relationships with your wife and kids. You'll enjoy being alive better, and it will produce an enormous amount of positivity in all aspects of your life and in every relationship you have, and in the world in general will flourish and bloom into a garden the likes of which we've never seen before.
Yep. Or
everything you love is destroyed horribly in the most horrible catastrophe ever. Pick which path you'd like. I vote for this one. I'm going to go that way. I invite you to join us in that directionality. And by the way, in the process of doing this, we're actually getting better and better and better at articulating the specifics. Like, what are the characteristics? What does it look like? A lot of it's obvious. If you're being a serious dick, stop doing that. Some of it's not so obvious. Some of it's a little bit more complicated, but
So, I mean, that thing of, let's look at the process that was happening when no matter what the products were, because they're various. Yep. But let's look at the process that was happening whenever good things were happening, and then let's try and replicate and grow that process as much as possible. Not in a static way, but in a way in which it can constantly evolve. That's what I meant by a meta vision, rather than a meta narrative. That what we're going to do is point people, right? But then I wanted to pick up on. Well, first of all, I wanted to give, I wanted you to say to Greg, I got a deeper appreciation for Greg's work, which I already appreciated deeply, and something he was saying here, because Gregg is doing many things, but one of the things Gregg is doing, right, and I often compliment him on being Aristotle, but that's not quite right. It's more because what Gregg is doing is he's trying to give us an intelligibility of the deep continuity that's going to be needed for us if we're going to be able to map, right, in a scale invariant way, right? What Gregg is doing is he's trying to provide Jacob's ladder between heaven and earth, if it'll allow me to speak methodologically, right? So that we can move up and down these levels with a shared form of language. So I just wanted to say, I think, right, that a commitment to us, not, I want to be really careful here because we're treading on terra incognita, right? But I'm not like we're still gonna have a self-organizing criticality that's oscillating between right. Let's take it for granted that that's going to be sacred to us, right? But we do need to get shared language for that process. And I was only thinking of it, now I'm sounding like Jordan, I was thinking of visual imagery. I was only thinking of it like horizontally, but what Gregg is pointing to is we need to also be doing the vertical, right? And he and I worked a lot on that in Untangling the World Knot. And that's exactly really important. I want to pick up on one other thing, because if we can get these two together, I think that's important. So part of what I'm saying the metavision includes is I think, Jordan, it's fair to say that it includes what I've been trying to get people to understand in a participatory fashion about dialogos. Dialogos is that metavision of let's try and figure out, right, in practice, right, how to get the processing working. That's the metavision. But I'm saying Gregg's also saying, no, he's not saying no. He's saying as well.
Yeah.
Right? You need something, a metavision that allows you to also move between the levels in a fluid and fluent fashion. Final point, and then I'll turn it back over to you guys. When Jordan, a while back, you were saying, religion and science like this, which, I agree with that in a fundamental way. So does Jonathan Pajot. But we're talking about the religion that's not a religion. And to shift off of the beliefs and the products, the way James Carr says, unfortunately we lost him not that long ago, the difference between religion and belief. He says, put aside, belief sets up like boundaries. Religion is about this ongoing right relationship to what he calls mystery. Now, if we want to shift off religion, one of the ways of getting the religion that's not a religion is to shift off the product onto the process as primary. And what religions do, and this could connect back up to Gregg's work, is they do something at the level of distributed cognition deeply analogous to individual cognition, because religions are constantly doing meta-assimilation, meta-accommodation. Sacred values. The two sacred poles are home and the horizon of the horrible. Awe and wonder, the numinous, right? And what religion constantly does is, okay, go out. Oh, the numinous, that's way too much. Okay, come back home. Here's home where you're safe. Go out again. Come back. Go out again, come back, right? And that is deeply analogous to accommodation and assimilation as the primary machinery, right, that Piaget talked about for individual cognition. So I think one of the part of the metavision is to tap into the relational recursive relevance realization and say, look, we're not going to tell you what to believe. That's ridiculous. That's non-viable anymore. We've all gone through the postmodern divide. But what we should do, what we know is, here's Jordan's language, it works well if it's doing this thing. If it's doing this self-organizing criticality, if it sends us out into the numinous, but it's like secure attachment for a child, right? The child is willing to explore the environment, but it can come home. But it's empowered to explore the environment, not the clinging, horrible mother or father, right? But it's empowered to explore the environment, then it can come home again and again and again. The religion that's not a religion should have that metavision at its core. That's what I'm proposing to you guys.
Beautiful. And if there's a lot I could pick up, but I'll say, because this is live for me. So one of my big events this week, John, this connects to our world view. I'm writing up on the history of consciousness. Okay? And one of my whole points is that modernity screws up the matter-mind relation. I mean, we get this mind-body thing. Okay? When I was taught about consciousness and all this other stuff, Rene Descartes, okay, and George Romanes were often contrasted. Rene Descartes says animals have no consciousness, they're automata. That's what I learned.
Yeah.
And then this guy, George Romanes, was one of the earliest comparative psychologists. He was a cousin of Darwin, wrote about animal intelligence and said things like crabs reason. Okay.
Yeah.
So then he was seen as completely anthropomorphizing and
Yeah.
over exaggerating. So these were the two guys then that we were then taught that, oh, well, it's a mystery, but here you go, here are your options. So this is what I did. John educated me about Rene Descartes, and I've also gone and looked and see. And it turns out that everything hinges on the language game here.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's what I discovered. Okay. So what George Romanes means by, I then looked at what he did in what's called Mental Evolution, one of his major books. Okay. He completely, very much like Rene Descartes, he completely divides human consciousness as self-conscious reflection, okay, versus animal consciousness. He has 50 different layers. Animals get up to 28, okay, apes, all right, and dogs. He loved dogs. Apes and dogs get to 28, and it goes to 50, okay, modern reflective adults, all right? So and what is all of this? It's culture-infused language and self-reflective consciousness, okay? That's what all this is. And then animal consciousness, the first 15 layers have nothing to do with sentience, but what I would call mind one, neuroinformation reflexive processing. That's right. And then at 16, the first thing he thinks of sentience, pleasure and pain, John, that goes to valence qualia. And then you get into emotion, and then you get into the social motivations in apes. And then they can actually even feel an intuitive morality. That's what he argues, okay? So, but when you actually look at it, here's the puncher, okay? For Romanes, he's talking about consciousness in my language between mind one and mind two, from non-conscious into sentience. That's what he means by conscience, okay? Rene Descartes talked about perceptions that become ready for reason and then are reflected upon, which is between mind two and mind three, okay? Yes. If you agree that if we say consciousness in Romanes' sense is mind one, Rene Descartes probably agrees with that animals have inner perception. He just defines it mechanistically. And they might sense pleasure and pain, but they don't reflect on it. It's because he calls reflection, the ready to reason, as conscious, and whereas Romanes calls the experience conscious, okay? When you have mind 1, 2, 3, they actually basically agree. Okay, they just locate consciousness either between mind 1 and mind 2, which of course then all animals, well, not all, many animals would have, okay? Or if you locate it between 2 and 3, then very few, or if none, would have, okay? So it's just a reference point of what consciousness means and the inadequate language games that then drives people also to commit to paradigms and then gets people narrowed in and says, I know what I'm talking about. No, you don't. Then we have this debate. And then you have everybody in defensive positions. So it is both a combination of our levels and dimensions, okay, of understanding that's erroneous, inadequate language games, and then a commitment to paradigms as truth, because they afford us transcendental reason in the empirical world that then is what the best kind of knowledge is, that I then defend, that then tracks us into all of this different.
Well, I'm going to throw another one in there. It's connected. I'm intrigued by how like certain threads come up that don't necessarily seem obvious, like why they're part of the conversation, but then another aspect will show up. So one of the things that's happened is that we've talked about this in our previous conversation of sort of the elision or the erasure of the commons, but as part of that, a shift of our community from a community that's boundary is defined by what I'll call real relationships of care to a community whose boundary is defined by shared narrative. Right, exactly. That's how that shit's been played out.
Boom. Oh, all right. I like that.
And what we are, of course, proposing is like that second move has got all kinds of problems built in, not the least of which is communities composed of shared narrative have a really bad habit of slaughtering each other in absolute catastrophe.
Yeah.
I mean, communities composed of boundaries of care also are engaged in conflicts, but it's not like ideological totalizing war of the same sort. And we're proposing is that there's a move, right, or in some sense a higher octave return to recohering fellowship, right? Where one big part of fellowship is in fact recovering community that is composed of relationships of care. And think about that from the simple point of like point of view or perspective, right? The things that you contain as ideas and thoughts, right?
Yep.
You know, we live in this world right now where because we've come so far away, like nobody has any friends that are real. Everybody has friends that are shared, like they have shared perspectives, which means, of course, is that as a particular boundary of shared perspective starts to migrate, you're either going to be a scapegoat and kicked out, or you have to continue to update and change your ideological commitments to keep track of the community because you have got nowhere else to go.
Yep.
You got no. If you actually are able to reground people in a community of care for each other as unique selves, right, Greg? The point of like not having influence, but actually being in deep relationship of authentic self, then the content of your particular perspectives is actually, the whole point is in some sense simultaneously not that relevant and super beautiful. Like, oh, cool. Like, I know you as a person. I care for you as a person. I'm in a relationship with you as a person. And therefore, on the one hand, you are absolutely able to hold opinions and perspectives that are very different than mine. That's a creative opportunity for us both to get deeper insight into how we came across those, which may in fact be shadow on my part, or maybe insight, or some weird combination of the two. And we're not going to, it doesn't create conflict, right? It creates generativity. And so you get this higher octave that actually is the answer to the problem that is being pointed at by the phrase diversity and inclusion, right? This is the real thing, right? This is real diversity, real inclusion, and an ideological simulacrum that is in fact, as you said, was a monoculture endeavoring to sort of simulate the thing. In fact, to take us further and further away from it. That's a lot and good. Right. And aside, one thing that I have had to deconstruct on the diversity side, yes, there's diversity and there's social justice. They fuse those things together and they're radically different ideas. Okay. So they use diversity. There's a diversity language for social justice and ideological monologue version of reality. And and I just try to help people. It's like, listen, you want to do social justice, but actually don't hide it under diversity, because actually diversity is a radically different thing. Diversity may come in and say, I think this is all bullshit. And then diversity means, oh, that's interesting, not, oh my God, you're an evil, immoral person, right? And it's like, oh, so, but the other thing I want to come back to, which is related, but it's been, the other thing that was on my mind, I love the way these things are coming on my mind, is I was in this conversation with this mathematician who studies quantum mechanics, and he was arguing for pluralism and what he called perspectivalism. Basically, I was like, he's like, there's so much more disunity, okay, in all of the different perspectives. We don't even agree what an electron is, what he was telling me, okay? And then we got into this conversation about the dialectic between, because at one point he's like, physics is even as disorganized as psychology. And I was saying, no. It's like, because the level of consensus, you have to understand where you are. Yes, there's all this diversity of opinion around what an electron is in the narrowness, but that's because you've accumulated an enormous amount of consensus in my estimation, that is not present in the psychological discipline. Okay, but then we got into this issue of, well, how do you hold the generalized consensual knowledge that makes the ontological claims of reality, okay, at some level, because there is some tension. After all, I live in a place where 50% of people believe the Earth's about 6,000 years old in the literal interpretation of the Bible, okay? So what do we mean? And when we talk about at that level of diversity, that gets tricky, right? It's like, okay, my kids are not learning about evolution in school. And it's like, shit, like, how do we socialize if half the people feel, that's a problem, okay? So my argument is, yes, there's a real inherent intention of how do we hold the subjective unique and the general integrated? And that is a dialectic. That's one of the issues. What I told him, and it clicked for me as to what I was doing. You guys know that I've given you this thing called this I-quad coin, okay? The technology of the I-quad coin, this side of the coin represents the subject. It represents the unique particulate subject, okay? That's your quadrant quadratic refers to your onto-epistemological experience of being. That's what it captures at every level of uniqueness. And then it embraces
what you are in your unique particular as being held. This, by the way, John, I was listening to you talk about history in the self lectures. Well, history concern, why does Napoleon win or lose the thing? You don't have a scientific lawful analysis of that. You do a historical contingent analysis of that, right? Because the language game of science is inductive generalizable laws, whereby the idiographic contingency of the particular that's not reliable is not part of really the scientific language game. But it doesn't mean it's wrong, right? So what am I saying is we need, one of the things that science tends to do, one of the things I see the modernity people do in science, is they get totally confused between the abstractions of their theory and the particulars of reality, okay? Now, they mistake the map for the territory in particular ways and forget that we need placeholders for the unique particular real, okay? So what I am saying is that part of our structure, what I'm really feeling we're doing is we're delineating the elements of the structure. So we drop in and say, hey, there's a wisdom energy way of being where we do recursive relevance realization and value the individual. We can then hold the unique perspectival of each individual as a node from that perspective, right? Also realizing that ultimately to achieve the necessary coherence as we go through this chaos is that we're also going to need the coherent integrated sense making, and the dialectic between those is part of what the dialogos is about and navigating.
I think that's good. I'm going to try and grab some things together. So we've got a thing, we're talking about diversity, and then Gregg was talking about, and Tillich was big about this, right? The tonos, the dialectic between individuation and participation. And then we've got religio, if you'll allow me that term, right? Constantly moving between home and the numinous, right? The horizon of horror, right? Moving between. And then what I'm using the individuation participation dialectic and the home horror dialectic to point to for the diversity thing is the hallmark of the kind of diversity we're talking about seems to be a system that is ultimately holds as sacred the capacity for self-correction. Right? So rather than, right, some kind of inertia or stability, right? Because I'm thinking about the group of, because I grew up with those people, Gregg.
I know you do.
1,000 years old, right? And the thing, so this is now sort of a question to you guys, maybe a problematic, is human beings, and Jordan, you and I have talked about this too, human beings have two responses, right? And we three talked about this too. You can pursue a simplification strategy, or you can pursue an evolvability strategy. We talked about this last time, right? And to me, this is one of the deepest divides we have to somehow work, because everything that we're talking about over here, this whole ball of wax, requires people not to commit to a belief structure or a meta-narrative, but it requires them to commit to self-correction. It requires them to commit to an evolvability response rather than a simplification response. And I think the only argument that is potentially available to us is Jordan's argument, which is, it reminds me of Yahweh in the Old Testament saying, there's two ways. Here's the way of life. Here's the way of death. I put these before you. Choose life. That's God speaking, right? And Jordan's argument, I take it, Jordan, what you're saying is, look, the simplification strategies won't work, right? We're pushing on them more and more and more, and they're tunneling us towards destruction. Now, the question I ask is, what do we say to people that say to us, that historical argument you're giving, future history argument, because that's what it is. Why isn't that just another crypto meta-narrative? You're slipping in under the carpet without acknowledging it. I've got you. I'm going to roll up my Derrida. I'm going to roll up my Foucault. You're just, because in the end, all of this depends on the meta-narrative of the future history, because history is a narrative. That's your point, Gregg. History isn't a science. History is a narrative. It's about an idiosyncratic causal sequence. So that's what do you guys say to that? Like that was the Socrates in my head saying, yes, look what's happened here. We've got all of this, and what it comes down to is a commitment, a deep commitment to a response either evolvability or simplification. And then what argument do we use to try and persuade people evolvability rather than simplification? It's Jordan. It's Jordan's core argument. And I love him for it. I'm not criticizing him. But what I'm saying is I can hear people, the people that I sometimes have to dialogue with, saying, you're just slipping in another grand history, another meta-narrative.
So I think this is actually not, I think there's a way to do this.
Yep.
Obviously, I ran into the problem that you've mentioned.
Yep. Yep.
And so you've created language and socialized the language that I think makes it very helpful.
Mm.
If you're doing it at the propositional level, then you're making two errors. One is that it won't work.
Yeah.
And the other is that it's the wrong mode. Right? You're actually doing it the wrong way. Right? And this is part of the problem. The problem is endeavoring to engage in argumentation at the level of the propositional.
Right.
But of course, the right answer is at the level of relevance realization, which is to say you live it into reality. Right? You live it with people. It's a living
beautification.
Right? Pardon?
The beautification strategy, right? You beautify the dialogos. Yes. I keep forgetting.
I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm not asking you to spend the time to parse the extremely complicated semantic structures and a theoretical basis. If you're interested in that kind of thing, it's all open source. It's all public. It's all out there. You can check the math. You can take a look at it. Gregg's doing the same thing. By the way, my engagement with Gregg is my ethical engagement with everything, right? Which is I take a look at it. I notice there's something meaningful. There's something helpful and useful in it. So I engage a little bit more. I notice that the more I engage, the more I metabolize it, the more nutritive it seems to be, meaning that it solves more problems, creates fewer issues. And, I can say that part of some red flags, like, okay, Gregg seems a little bit enthusiastic about his own theory. He talks about his theory a lot. He creates fucking coins and weird trees in the background. All right, be careful. Right, always be careful.
Totally. Amen, brother.
Dude, like we all got all kinds of.
My clinical psychologist says to do that. Be careful.
Be careful. Right.
Be careful for me.
At the end of the day, this is all going to be decided at the level of livingness. It's all going to be decided at the level of the local, of the actual interpersonal relationship, right? So it's not, hey, person in my neighborhood who believes the earth was created 6,000 years ago, let me sit you down and explain to you that you're kind of super stupid and wrong.
Yep.
Let me actually do this. Just throw that stuff to the side. There's a flood. Our town is about to get watered and flooded. Let me reach my hand out to your hand and notice that your hand is strong and skillful and capable and able to make commitments to doing things. They're the important things that evolution, from my perspective, right, relevance realization has brought up as being virtue, right?
Yes.
Let's birth virtue into the world through virtue itself by actually embodying it into the world. So the naming of it will come later.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah, and that's at the core of the dialogues, right? I'm talking about Plato's dialogue. It's all about, and that's why the dialogues often end in propositional aporia. And they end with, Dan Chappie and I just read the Meno together. You can't teach virtue, you have to catch it, right? Catch it from other people. And Plato says that in the 7th letter. You have to live, and you have to live with people until a spark catches, right? And then and that's the only way. That he thought he came to the realization that's the only way that he could ever teach people, and that's why he set up the academy. You have to live with people. So I guess then I
want to say one piece here because I think it's my own personal experience because what I just said could be taken many different ways. So I'd like to make it more precise.
Yeah, please.
I had a friend once in law school. And it was very interesting because we were at Harvard Law School, right? So it's extremely pretentious and extremely, the church, right? It has a very particular frame. He wasn't of that frame. He was actually an evangelical Christian and became more so. Like from his first year to his second year, he really went through a deeper experience, which, by the way, it was an interesting signal for me because he became much healthier, right? From second year, he became a person of much higher level of integrity, top to bottom.
Right.
And what I've noticed is that, if I look at it and by the way, of course, I was 27, right? I was a relatively young person. Many of the things that he said and believed seemed to me to be what's called obviously wrong, right? In many ways, politically, nutritionally, fill in the blank, right? I have noticed that as I have gotten older, I have noticed that many of the things that he was pointing out as being right ways to think and or believe have proven to be more right than the ones that the 27-year-old me was holding, right? There is a wisdom that precedes language. And as you said, Greg, like, it's mostly because I didn't understand what the fuck he was talking about, right? He used the word consciousness and I used the word consciousness, and I'm like, you're completely out of your mind. It turns out we're talking about different stuff. And as I've learned to become more capable of listening and really sensing what's trying to express itself, oftentimes which has nothing to do with words, has to do with many other deeper things like lineages and wisdom over long periods of time and stuff like that, and like the important stuff in life, like how do you really build a religion so that this thing has integrity over diverse experiences and many different iterations of humanity. Totally. I'm like, right. So my grain of salt here is not only, I'm not saying that the person across the river and the flood and the graying of hands and you're a real concrete person. I'm also saying, by the way, that once we achieve a relationship that is more fundamental than our beliefs, we begin to actually be able to enter into a relationship where the deeper basis that gives rise to them is more important in the first place. And of course, we'll find out that many of my beliefs are on the basis of error, on the basis of random mappings. Like I just, for whatever reason, I kind of glued two things together that didn't obviously belong in the right place. Trauma and defense mechanisms, it's all kinds of stuff. But there's also all kinds of really interesting generativity in that relationship. So that's the point I was trying to make, this to say, hey, there's deeper, more meaning that we form. That's where the rest of the stuff begins to sort itself out. And it can sort itself out if it's founded well.
Right.
To me, Jordan, I see something that I didn't see before. The Civium project is there then central, because if this comes down to people living together well, we're not. That's your argument about the Civium. We're not living together well. We're not architecturally, resource management. We're not living together well. We're living in cities which until recently had all these advantages, and we were willing to put up with all the costs. But we know that we don't live well together in cities in the way you're talking about, right? Yeah. We don't live in a way that plugs into our machinery so that we can catch and transmit virtue to each other in an appropriate manner. So that the Civium then has to play an important role in this, right? And then the relationship between the Civium and the cyber culture, exactly.
Yeah.
Getting optimal grip on that.
And I also want to say, in terms of, goes back to evolvability and what we're asking for people, or what's healthiest as we move into this space. So we talk about belief, as we listen to other people's belief, we enter their space, as we think about our own, and the capacity to see the reaction of the other. So it's just empathizing with where they're coming from, but also empathizing where they're coming from in relationship to you.
Yeah.
Okay? So let me say, for the record, that's insane. Okay, like at one level, there would be, in terms of I tell my students all the time, I said, I'm obsessed with this, and you should react. You should have signals go off. Okay, is this guy a quack? What is he doing in relationship to this? Those are all very healthy signals. Okay, in relation, and I know that, and that's just. And so what I'm saying is that as we enter into the space of both the empathy of the other, it's also empathy of the other in relationship to what they will react to in you. Okay? And if we can hold that space without reactivity, again, latching onto a belief that says this is a bad, I have to hold my ego of justification in a particular way. Let go of that. That's going to create a principle and process that's a lot more conducive to the recursive rational value.
Well, exactly, Greg. I mean, the order of how I got into Gregg was that, Gregg, because Gregg sent me stuff and I looked at a system, and I was like, Jordan, I've seen so many systems, right? But then Gregg and I started talking, and Gregg, I got tremendous affection for you because your commitment to good faith dialogue and to openness and to integration and to hearing the other and to internalizing it, that became crystal clear to me. And then I started to look at your system. Mm-hmm. That's how it worked for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? That's how it worked for me.
Right. And that's how it should work. Because there are a hell of a lot of systems out there, and there are a lot of quacks. And I'm happy if the question's still open on that one for me.
I'll keep drinking from the well until the water turns bitter, and then we'll be done.
Amen. I respect that wholeheartedly.
So at some point, we should probably draw this to a close. Because I think but at some point, I would like to bring up as a central topic for us then, because it seemed to me to be where everything was drawing together. And the, you know, virtue and dialectic and what I just brought up with George. What does this mean? And this goes towards your ideas too, Greg, about well-being. What does it mean? And I mean, let's do this like a Socratic dialogue. What does it mean to live well together, such that we can catch virtue from each other in the way that Zach is emphasizing, Zach Stein? What does it mean for us to live well together so that across generations we catch and transmit virtue? What does that mean? I propose that we try and bring that to the core of a shared dialogos.
And I would like to invoke it into the hyper conversation.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Consider it so invoked.
All right, guys, that was fun.
That was great. So happy holidays, you too. And,
yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
We'll find another time sometime, but everybody have a good holiday out there.
Yeah. And thank you all of you who are watching and participating in the vital hyper conversation. Take good care, my friends.